Hey, welcome back to class. Today we're going to be taking a look at what the frickin' heck an RPG is, and whether or not it's the right place to start off your gaming journey. So, let's get into it. We'll start off, as I like to do, with defining our terms. What is an RPG? Well, the basic answer is that an RPG is a role-playing game, and that can take the form of anything, really. A video game, a tabletop game, or something like playing pretend with your friends on the playground. Regardless of medium, though, a role-playing game has you take the role of a particular character or archetype and act that out. Now, on the surface, that might sound kind of boring, like, what, you're just given a script and you play that out? Isn't that just acting? Well, no, not exactly. The key mechanic in a role-playing game is choice. No matter what the medium is, you're given the freedom to make whatever choices you want. In a video game, that might mean making the choice to kill the antagonist or spare their life, or, less consequentially, whether or not to pet that dog. No matter what medium you choose, though, the defining element of an RPG is choice, and that is what makes RPGs different than just your standard video game. You might hear someone make the argument that all video games are RPGs because no matter what the game is, you're playing a role. You're almost never literally playing you in the life that you're living in now. So the argument goes that if you're always playing a role in a game, then all games are RPGs. And while that's technically not wrong, it's missing the point. As I said before, the defining feature of an RPG is choice. You need to be able to make choices which drive the story around you. And in many games, that means changing the outcome rather drastically. Now, as with everything, the degree to which this is true for a game is down to how well the developers implement it. A game could be billed as an RPG and make you feel like your choices are having an effect, but in fact, if you actually play through multiple times, you realize that the story does the same thing regardless of how you change your playstyle. And while I wouldn't say that these are, strictly speaking, not RPGs, I also wouldn't consider them good RPGs. However, I can't simply paint all games that fall under that umbrella as just RPGs. As always, it's a bit more complicated than that, but we can generally simplify it into three main subgenres of RPG: the Western RPG, the JRPG, and the Action RPG. Let's start with the Western. This is your Skyrims, Fallouts, and Avoweds of the world. Games which are generally set in a world which is very much created with a Western lens. Oftentimes, they're set in a Tolkienian fantasy world, though they don't have to be like Fallout or Cyberpunk. These are usually set in a first-person perspective and generally have real-time action combat, though they have a tendency to focus on story and exploration more than combat in particular. They usually try to have long and branching dialogue trees with ample opportunity to change the course of the story drastically through your dialogue alone. They're also the types of games which will generally let the world tell you about itself. What do I mean by that? Well, instead of having a large opening crawl explaining what's going on or explicit narration of the story, these games like to let you find notes, listen to conversations, or deduce from the world around you what's going on. This type of RPG is great for those of us who really like discovering a world for ourselves. People who really prefer when a story shows instead of tells, and people who want to have that experience of discovery. Now, I want to say before moving on, game genres are messy. While these borders tend to be true, there is a lot of cross-pollination between genres and subgenres. So, while I may make it sound like all Western RPGs are exactly this, and action RPGs are exactly that, that's by no means true. You can find plenty of games which mix these mechanics and devices, so just keep that in mind. But now that we have a pretty good idea of what a Western RPG is, let's talk about Japanese RPGs, or JRPGs. JRPGs differ from Western RPGs mainly in their combat mechanics. The term JRPG tends to refer to games which use a more turn-based combat. This is where everyone in a combat scenario has to wait their turn to attack, and generally you control directly what your party members do. For example, think of what's probably most people's first introduction to JRPGs, Pokemon. Pokemon has a lot of the staples of JRPGs, but it's a bit more beginner-friendly. You have things like a party that you need to strategize how to use most optimally in battle. They have random encounters, which are the bane of any new JRPG player, as well as a lack of control over the story. Now, I want to be clear, there are plenty of JRPGs which let you affect and control the story. However, in general, they lean more towards you having to deal with the decisions of others, rather than making others deal with your decisions like Western RPGs are wont to do. JRPGs tend to focus more on the turn-based strategy rather than the story. So in this case, that choice shows itself in the strategy of combat rather than in story. Again, generally, I want to make it clear, I'm not a JRPG guy. I've tried many and bounced off of almost all, so I'm certainly not going to be your best positive source when it comes to this particular type of RPG, because it just simply isn't really for me. However, if you know that you like to take your time a bit more to think out your moves, and you prefer to focus on the strategy and optimization of a battle, JRPGs might be right up your alley. And they still absolutely have the potential to offer that same exploration and free roam experience that many Western RPGs are known for, so don't feel like you need to exclude this as an option just because you know you like that. But that brings us to our third subgenre, action RPGs. Now these are a bit more interesting analytically to me. They can really take the form mechanically of either of the other two subgenres that we just talked about, except they inevitably have a major focus on fast-paced and highly difficult combat. I think the perfect example of an action RPG is pretty much any game made by FromSoft, except maybe Kingsfield, but we can talk about immersive sims later in the course. From Software is best known for their Dark Souls games, and pretty much all of their games follow that combat formula. It's a formula which heavily focuses on player skill and reaction timing. You explore a deadly and unforgiving world in search of a number of incredibly memorable and relentless bosses, which you need to beat to move on to the next segment of the game. Now, that particular style is so iconic, it's kind of become a subgenre of its own by the name of Souls-like, but if we zoom out, there are elements which firmly plant Souls games in the broader action RPG genre. Things like free exploration, a high level of difficulty, relatively low story contents, and what story there is usually gets communicated to the player through environmental storytelling, plus a major focus on player leveling, and we can talk about that more in depth in the next segment, but for now, what you need to know is that these games generally have a player level system which increases as you play and gain experience, which is then spent to improve your abilities. But I think that should give you a good idea of these three major subgenres of RPG that you have available to pick from. As a recap, we have Western RPGs, which are generally more focused on story, exploration, and real-time combat. We have JRPGs, which focus on turn-based combat with a more tactical, methodical approach. And then we have action RPGs, which focus on fast-paced, high-difficulty, real-time combat with relatively little story. Now again, these are just three very broad buckets to help you wrap your head around the different types of RPGs out there. Most in the real world borrow from each other, and you're usually going to see a bit more of a mix of different mechanics, like a lot of older Western-style RPGs, sometimes referred to as computer RPGs or CRPGs, have turn-based combat like JRPGs, which stems from the technical limitations of the time. But that style has become beloved by a lot of people, so don't go thinking that all RPGs will fit perfectly into one of these three buckets. As with everything in life, there's a lot of nuance and exceptions to the rules, but this is a 101 class, so we'll assume this rather limited picture to be broadly representative of the whole picture. Alright, now with all that in mind, let's look at some of the staple mechanics of the RPG genre, which you can expect to run into in any game that falls into one of these three buckets, and some tips for how to best navigate those mechanics as a beginner. Skill trees are one of the most common mechanics you'll encounter in an RPG. Simply put, they show what skills your character has and what path your character is on, and which skills you'll be able to get if you continue down that path. What do I mean by path? Well, something that goes hand in hand with skill trees is character archetypes or classes. These are things like fighter, archer, thief, wizard, things like that. You'll usually pick your character's class at the beginning of the game, and that will determine what skills you have to begin with and what playstyle your character will most be adept at least at the beginning. This is something you can usually change throughout the game, but it gives you a place to start. Each class comes with its own set of skills and proficiencies. So if we think about, say, an archer, sometimes referred to as a rook or an elf, whatever you call it, it's the class which has a focus on ranged attacks. They have some skill with stealth, but it's not a main focus. Usually they strike from afar, and in general, they're a bit of a jack-of-all-trades, master of bow. The particulars, though, aren't really important right now, but the point is that each one of these proficiencies that I just mentioned correlates with a skill that you'll be able to develop as you play the game. So let's take the bow. At the start of the game, you're probably able to kill enemies with maybe 5 shots. You have a stealth attack, which does a little bit more damage than your base attack, and you have a deep quiver, so you can hold more arrows than, say, a wizard could. As you play the game and level up your character, you'll be able to increase your abilities in those areas. So maybe once you get to level 5, you can kill someone in 3 shots, or you can shoot faster, or you can hold even more arrows. Those will all be correlated with which skills you pick from your skill tree. The important takeaway is that in general, it's a good idea to lean into your specialty. Invest in skills that will help your particular class. So again, if you're an archer, invest your skill points into the skills that relate to the areas of the game that you use the most, like archery or stealth attacks. But in general, you don't want to spread your limited amount of upgrade points too thin. So if you don't use, say, magic in your playthrough, don't invest in skills which benefit magic, even if they're super cool, because usually the cooler and more powerful the skill is, the more points that it will require to attain. Now, if you find yourself a little ways into the game and decide you want to change your mind and change your class, you can usually respec your character, so you can, for a small price, get those upgrade points back and change your proficiencies. And this can be a great way to try out different playstyles and classes without having to totally restart a whole new playthrough if you're not into that. However, that's not a bad idea. If you really like the game, sometimes it can be a drastically different and just as great experience with a different class, and playing through again can be a great way to experience a game you love from a totally different angle. But all this talk about skills brings up the question, what about leveling? How does that work? Leveling is going to be different from game to game, and so are skills and generally everything about the game, but you can expect some patterns across titles. For instance, generally you gain experience by killing enemies. However, this isn't usually the best way to gain experience points, or XP. No, usually completing quests for different NPCs, or non-player characters, is the best and most efficient way to gain XP. There are usually levels to how much XP you get from different quests though. For instance, a main story objective may give you 1000 XP, whereas going and fetching a special rock for Timmy down the street may only net you 10. This is meant to encourage you to engage with the story and reward you for doing so. But side quests can cumulatively be a really great way to rack up those experience points. And just because direct random combat isn't the most efficient way to gain XP, doesn't mean it's not the most fun. Like in Avowed, for example, I've leveled up quite a bit by just walking around and stumbling into combat encounters and different side quests around the map which have nothing to do with the main story. And in a lot of RPGs, that's the entire point of the game. You can absolutely beeline the story, but you're really supposed to be immersing yourself in the world. That's kind of the whole appeal. So don't be afraid to stray from the beaten path. Oftentimes, that's what separates a mediocre RPG from a truly brilliant one. But speaking of great RPGs, you won't find many without a solid grasp on our next point. Many people come to RPGs for the story, and in particular, the branching dialogue options. A lot of people judge whether an RPG is good or not based on how well it handles dialogue, and if it gives you the option to truly make your own choices. In general, I agree with that stance, though I think it can be a bit more nuanced than that, but on the whole, dialogue trees are pretty key to a lot of RPGs, and it's something that many people come to the genre for. Dialogue trees are basically what they sound like. In every encounter you have with an NPC, be it an important main story character or Timmy down the street, you have options of how to respond to their dialogue. So if Timmy asks you to go get his very special rock, you can either tell him, "Of course I'll go get your rock," or you could say, "Depends. How much are you willing to pay for it, Timmy?" Or you could just say, "Shove off, kid, I'm busy." In a good RPG, all those options will have a different response from Timmy, and in a great RPG, they'll all have an effect on the story. How, you ask? Well, in an RPG which has the budget and time to really put in the effort, even the smallest actions can be made to have consequences down the line. And I'm not talking ham-fisted consequences that make no sense, like not getting that rock for Timmy shouldn't prevent you from beating the final boss or something like that. No, but maybe Timmy's mom is the town sheriff, and maybe Timmy told her what kind of person you are, and now you need to sneak into a room you would have potentially just been able to ask for access to, now risking getting caught and punished even further. And if even small dialogue choices can have that kind of effect on your playthrough, you could conceivably have a game that's infinitely replayable, but not in the scummy, free-to-play live service way. Now, that's the ideal, that's kind of the gold standard, but few, if any, games really go to that level, because that would mean somebody would have to write all of that dialogue and think of all the potential occurrences and code them in, so that kind of thing will balloon a game's budget exponentially. But the games that attempt that are generally the ones that people love and remember as long as they have all their other fundamentals covered. In general, I think a good way to approach dialogue trees as a beginner is to think of your character's background, and think how that background might influence your character and how they might respond to a given piece of dialogue. Now, is this how I play all of my RPGs? Absolutely not. I have a tendency to just default to the nice and permissive answer because I don't like being a dick and I don't want to cut off myself from any potential expansions to the story or anything like that, but many people love just playing around and seeing what people will say and what effect it could have. One thing that some studios will do in order to get around that exponential scope creep issue that I mentioned is to have your companions react to your dialogue options. So, maybe a companion who is a fighter responds well to antagonistic responses, whereas a cleric might be more approving of a more compassionate and understanding protagonist. That kind of thing kind of lets the devs give you more consequences for your actions without having to code in specific events for every single possible outcome. They can instead give you consequences by lowering the approval of the person you might be trying to romance, or a character you just find cool and want to be friends with. Regardless though, dialogue is one of those staple mechanics in RPGs which really makes the genre what it is. But that's not the only thing. The last mechanic we'll touch on is one that can be kind of divisive and even detrimental to the feeling of playing a game. And that is loot is one of those things that, for many, is kind of a love it or hate it type of deal. Though on this channel, we like to focus on a bit more of a nuanced approach, so that's what we'll do. Loot is a great way that RPGs reward players for exploration or achieving difficult tasks. Many people kind of malign it though, because it has a tendency to be a bit difficult to nail the balance of. While it's super rewarding to open a chest and find a cool armor set or an awesome new weapon, a lot of RPGs have a tendency to overdo it a bit. In a really bad example of this, you could see far too many high-level loot items given out for not that much effort, and which just kind of makes them worthless. But a more common issue that I've run into with loot is when everything is a crafting item. Crafting is a mechanic which we aren't really going to touch on in today's class, but in RPGs, a lot of the time you'll be able to craft things like potions, armors, or weapon upgrades. And when that is the case, if the developer doesn't exercise a bit of restraint, it can be very easy to overload the player with crafting materials and stuff to pick up for crafting. This is one of the issues that I have in the recent release Avowed. Overall, I love that game and you should absolutely check it out if you think you're interested in more Western style RPGs, but one thing I do find a bit annoying is just how many crafting materials you get whenever you loot anything. It seems like every enemy or chest that you find has some random branch or useless low-level weapon. I won't get into critiquing Avowed here, but this is a common issue I've seen in a lot of RPGs from all different subgenres. And if there isn't a very clear and useful purpose for those materials, they can end up numbing the player to the effect that the looting is supposed to have. However, while it might have its issues and naysayers, it does serve a useful purpose. Loot serves as a reward, and a lot of game development is about figuring out how to reward your player and keep them coming back. The recent Zelda games did this incredibly well. They used loot and the promise of loot to actually drive exploration. They do a really amazing job limiting how much you can get in general, and so when you do find something, it's always rewarding. And they make sure to put that loot at points of interest, so if you see something in the distance that you want to go check out, you can pretty reliably assume that there will be at least something good there. Generally, there aren't many strategies around loot from the player side. The only thing I would say to keep in mind is that in a loot-heavy game, inventory management can become a pretty necessary skill to develop. Otherwise, you'll constantly be seeing that dreaded over-encumbered alert and walking like half speed. But other than that, just pick up everything, sell or dismantle what you don't need, and keep moving. It's pretty straightforward. Alright, now you've got a bit of a better idea of what RPGs are and what kinds of players might be interested in them. So now the last thing to do is to decide if this is a genre for you. Don't be discouraged by the prevailing idea that only sweaty, hardcore gamers care about RPGs. There are all kinds out there, and playing pretend is one of those things that humans just kind of universally love to do. Plus, even if you're just here for the cool outfits and cute romanceable characters, there are plenty of those to go around. Ultimately, I would recommend RPGs to players who enjoy story, who like exploration and open-ended experiences. Maybe you loved choose-your-own-adventure books when you were in middle school, or maybe you just loved fantasy cartoons and movies on TV. Ultimately, as with all game genres, I think there's something out there for everyone. There's so much experimentation and mixing of genres that it's really difficult to say that one whole genre just simply isn't for you. So if any of this has sounded at all interesting to you, I highly recommend you give RPGs a shot. They really aren't as scary or daunting as they might seem at first glance. Just go out there and have fun. I promise you won't be disappointed. But that's just about all we have time for in today's class. I hope you've learned something useful, and I hope I was able to help shed some light on the world of RPGs and maybe give you somewhere to start. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I'm positive I missed something, so let me know down there, or you can head over to the Discord and we can chat it up over there. It's a really great community, and if you're looking for some like-minded people to play games with or just chat about whatever, go check out that. It's totally free, so why not give it a shot? And if you want even more direct access to me and my brain, consider becoming a member of the channel. It really helps me out, and it helps make all of this a lot more sustainable. But even if you choose not to do any of that, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a video. I hope to see you here next week, and as always, happy gaming.